For over 100 years, the mentally ill were locked away and hidden from society in vast Victorian asylums. In the last decades of the asylums, psychiatrists tried to cure as well as care for patients. Some of their attempts were barbaric. Some people felt that science was being pushed too far. These institutions had to be shut down. When it happened, it was a moment of history. This is the story of the closing of the asylums and the troubles they left behind. Longgrove Hospital, formerly Longgrove Asylum, was a mental hospital, part of the Epsom Cluster of hospitals in the Horton area of Epsom. The facility became Longgrove Mental Hospital in 1918 and the Longgrove Hospital in 1937, right up until it joined the National Health Service in 1948. After the introduction of care in the community in the 1980s, the hospital reduced in size and closed in 1992. Most of the buildings were subsequently demolished. Those which were retained were converted into apartments and incorporated into Clarendon Park, a new development of houses and flats. Parts of the surrounding landscape grounds have been preserved and now form part of the Horton Country Park. The Epsom Cluster, also referred to as the Horton Estate, was a cluster or group of 5 large psychiatric hospitals situated on land to the west of Epsom. The cluster comprised of Horton Hospital, Longgrove Hospital, Manor Hospital, St Ebbas Hospital and West Park Hospital. When it was formed in 1888, the London County Council took over the responsibility for thousands of mentally ill. Their families could no longer look after them, or had never done so. Many of these people were elderly, and some had been living in workhouses. The LCC needed new buildings to house them, and in 1896, its asylum committee bought some land at Horton in Epsom. It was a large area of land capable of supporting 5 or 6 mental hospitals, the largest concentration of them in the country. The asylums at the time were growing much faster than they had expected. Soon there would be up to 10,000 people. Some of them would be discharged after a short stay, but the hospital regime was set up to look after people rather than to cure them. Many, perhaps most, would remain at Horton until they died. And at the time, the people of Epsom did not want the peace and dignity of its cemetery to be spoilt by an influx of pauper lunatics. The asylums committee were told, firmly but politely, that they would need a cemetery of their own. So the asylum engineer came down to find a site. He was looking for a small plot of land away from the hospitals themselves, but easy to get to. The corner of Hook Road and Horton Lane seemed to fit the bill. It was already owned by the LCC and stood at some distance from the existing asylums. There was only one problem. The site rested on a sticky clay soil. Water bubbled up in holes almost as soon as they were dug, so the borough surveyor insisted that drains should be laid below the level of the graves to clear the water. It could run off into a holding pond on the other side of Horton Lane. Throughout 1899, Mr. Brown was kept busy planning the new cemetery. It would hold 900 graves in rows on either side of a central path. Like the hospital grounds, it was to be marked off from the road by an iron fence. In 1899, on the 31st of July, the cemetery received its first burial. Annie James, who'd been at the manor. The asylums committee were anxious to keep down costs. They did not put up memorials, although they had no objection to these if they were provided by relatives. Sarah Hubbard was admitted to the manor in August 1901 and died a month later. Her brother put up a headstone shortly afterwards. Others were to follow, perhaps 30 or 40 over the next 5 decades. this was a tiny proportion of those buried there. But most families were too poor to afford a memorial, or had lost touch altogether with their relatives at Horton. The building of the Epsom Cluster of mental hospitals went on as planned. St Ebbas in 1902, Longgrove in 1907, and West Park was the last one in 1924. At the beginning, the hospitals were quite conscientious about the upkeep of the cemetery. Double rows of poplar trees were planted in 1901, and 2 years later the cemetery was enlarged. The chapel became dirty, so the asylum engineer was told to sort it out. But as things were still being done on the cheap, the whole funerals were rather lax and not what was expected for a funeral. The drainage problems continued, and at the time there was more than 1,000 grave spaces available. But more room was needed by the 1920s, as up to 3 burials were being made in each grave. The coffins were wood, and of course wood floats. If the grave filled with water, there could be distressing scenes. If the asylum's committee economised on graves, they were positively lavish when it came to places of worship. The funerals were held in a tin building and were a much smaller affair. The chaplain would walk over to the cemetery. He would conduct a brief service. The coffin would already be waiting in the chapel, having been wheeled down the lane on a small bier. Normally, each individual received their own funeral service, but sometimes they were buried in batches. The 1950s transformed the Epsom cluster of hospitals. They were no longer supposed to be isolated, self-sufficient communities. Now it was hoped that patients would stay for a shorter period, and that there would be fewer of them. Numbers fell from the thousands to the hundreds. And in 1955 the Hook Road Cemetery was closed. The grounds continued to be maintained as a garden of rest. The tin chapel disappeared, and in its place a small paved area where the few headstones were set under a weeping willow tree. It continued in good order until the 1970s. The authorities had lost interest in the cemetery, and the remaining headstones were being vandalised. So in 1983, the Regional Health Authority sold the land to a private individual. He had no interest in maintaining the land as a cemetery, as he was a property developer. There were proposals to use it as a market garden or a car park, but that all came to nothing. The condition of the grounds grew worse in time. Up to as many as 9,000 patients, war casualty soldiers and children lie buried within the old Horton Hospital Site. There have been plans for the private buyer to get permission one day to concrete over the graves and use the site for leisure development. The state of this derelict, unattended former cemetery remains an insult to all of us who care. I hope to be able to bring some of these stories to life and tell you about some of the people that are still buried there in the Horton Cemetery, including the Titanic disaster survivor George Pelham and some of the other cemetery's notable residents. I hope you will listen to some of these stories as I attempt to bring them back to life again.